I've always prided myself on being able to read people like an open book. 15 years as a surgeon at Chicago General Hospital had taught me to notice the smallest details: the trembling of hands, the rapidity of breathing, the barely perceptible drops of sweat on a patient's forehead. But in my own life, I found myself strikingly blind. Our home in Lincoln Park had always seemed to me to be the perfect embodiment of the American dream. The old 3-story red brick mansion with white columns at the front door came at an unbelievable bargain price in 2008. I still remember how Vivian, inspecting the spiral staircase in the lobby, said, "Terrence, this is destiny. This is where our children are supposed to live." We never had children, but we turned the house into a museum of American history. My passion for collecting historical artifacts was perfectly realized here. On that January morning, everything was going smoothly. I walked down to the first floor, where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted from the kitchen. Vivian always got up before I did, so that she could make breakfast before work. It was a habit she'd picked up early in our marriage and hadn't changed over the years, just like her love of French pastries on Saturdays. "Good morning, darling." Vivian stood at the stove, her blonde hair gathered into a careless bun. She was wearing her favorite ivory silk robe, a gift from me last Christmas. "I made your favorite blueberry pancakes." Smells delicious." I kissed her cheek, noting the new perfume. She used to prefer lighter scents. Our kitchen was my pride. Vintage mahogany cabinets I'd restored myself, marble countertops, and a collection of antique copper pots hung over the island. On the wall hung a 1,871 map of Chicago, one of my favorite acquisitions. "How are the conference preparations going?" Vivian asked, pouring me coffee. I'd been working on a presentation on new techniques in cardiac surgery for the past few months. "Almost finished the presentation. All that's left is to add statistics on recent surgeries." I unfolded the morning paper. Despite the digital age, I remained loyal to the paper press. "And how's your new project?" Vivian worked as a development manager for a large pharmaceutical company. For the past 6 months, she'd often stayed late, explaining it was an important project to bring a new drug to market. "Everything's going according to plan." She turned away from the window, taking a sip of coffee. "You know, I had an idea to update my closet. Why don't we go to the furniture store this weekend?" It was so like her to have sudden ideas for remodeling the house. In 15 years of marriage, we'd already changed the bedroom 4 times and the living room 3 times. Vivian always said the house should evolve with us. "Sure, honey. Just let's do it this afternoon. I have a meeting with Marcus in the morning." "With Marcus? You haven't seen him in a while." Some odd note flashed in her voice. "Yes, he called yesterday. Wants to discuss his Civil War coin collection. Says he found something interesting." Marcus Reynolds was an old friend from my residency. He was now the head of the trauma department at Northwestern Hospital, and we didn't see each other as often as I would have liked. Vivian sat down across from me, stirring her oatmeal thoughtfully. She'd barely touched her food in the mornings lately, citing a new diet. Her graceful fingers with their flawless manicure twitched slightly. "Terrence," she set the spoon aside. "There's something I need to tell you." I looked up from the paper. Vivian nervously fixed a strand of hair, a gesture I knew by heart. It was what she always did when she was worried. "Remember I was talking about our department's annual performance?" She paused. "We exceeded management's expectations, and the company they've decided to reward the best employees." "That's wonderful, dear." I was genuinely pleased. Vivian always worked hard. "Yes, it's really wonderful." She fixed her hair again. "We've been given vouchers, a week on a cruise ship in the Caribbean, all inclusive." "A cruise?" I raised my eyebrows in surprise. "But you don't like sea travel. Remember when you got motion sickness on that boat in Miami?" "That was a long time ago." She stood up quickly from the table. "Besides, it's a liner, not a speedboat. Totally different." I watched her rinse her cup under the faucet. Her movements were a little abrupt, hurried. "When's the trip?" "In 2 weeks." She didn't turn around. "January 23rd. I've already applied for vacation." "That soon? And for how long?" 7 days. We're leaving from Miami, Then there will be stops on various islands. She finally turned to me. You'll be okay without me for a week, right? Of course I can handle it, I smiled. Just don't forget to buy sunscreen. Remember how you got sunburned last year in Santa Barbara? Vivian nodded and looked at her watch. I should get ready. Important meeting today. I finished my coffee, watching her walk up the stairs. Something about her gait, the tilt of her head, seemed unfamiliar to me. But I dismissed the thought. After all, I was used to trusting my wife. In 15 years of marriage, we had no reason to doubt each other. I folded the paper, kissed my wife before I left, and headed to the hospital where a complicated open-heart surgery awaited me. It's always cool in the operating room. This is one of those details that you get so used to that you stop noticing, like the quiet humming of the ventilator and the beeping of the heart monitor. I stood at the operating table, leaning over the open chest of a patient, a 62-year-old man with a severe aortic valve defect. Clamp, my voice sounded muffled from behind the mask. Nurse Ruth, who had been working with me for 10 years, handed me the instrument before I finished the word. The surgery went on as usual, but my thoughts kept returning to the morning's conversation. Something scratched at my consciousness like a burr I couldn't quite pick up. Why hadn't Vivian mentioned the cruise earlier? She usually shared news from work right away. Dr. Holbrook, the anesthesiologist's voice brought me back to reality, his blood pressure's dropping. I blinked, focusing on the monitors. The next 2 hours required total concentration, no extraneous thoughts, just precise, calibrated hand movements and clear commands. After the operation, I went into my office. The walls were lined with diplomas and certificates, but my gaze always stopped at an old photograph of me and Vivian against the backdrop of the Grand Canyon, young and happy. It was our first trip together, before we were even married. Terrence? Ruth knocked on the door. Mrs. Parker is here to see you for a consultation. The day was scheduled to the minute. Consultations, rounds, talking to the patient's relatives. A routine that was usually satisfying, but today it felt fake, like I was watching from the sidelines. In the evening, while going through the mail, I came across a notice from the bank about a large transaction. Vivian usually handled such things. She had a natural knack for finances. I opened the letter, expecting to see another utility bill or insurance bill. $15,000. The amount had been debited in favor of the Royal Caribbean Cruise Company. I frowned. If the trip was a gift from the company, why did the charge go to our card? There must be some kind of mistake, I muttered, dialing Vivian's number. The beeps came one after another, until finally it went to voicemail. Strange. She usually always answered my calls. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the ceiling of my office. Shadows from the branches of the old maple tree outside the window danced on the white surface. That maple had been here before the hospital was built, a real old-timer, having survived 2 world wars and the Great Depression. The phone vibrated, a message from Vivian. Sorry, darling. Important meeting. We'll talk at home. For the rest of the day, I couldn't concentrate. Even discussing tomorrow's surgeries with the interns passed like a blur. Dr. Holbrook, are you okay? Dr. Sarah Chang, a young up-and-coming cardiologist, asked. You seem a little distracted today. I'm fine, just a lot on my mind. I tried to smile. By the way, how's your patient in room 312 doing? I got home late. There was a light on in the hallway, but the house was unaccustomedly quiet. There was a note on the kitchen table, written in familiar, elegant handwriting. I'm sorry I had to stay late at work. Don't expect me for dinner. Warm up the lasagna in the fridge. Love, V. I stared at the last word, love. How many times in 15 years had I seen those notes? Hundreds, thousands. But today something was different. The handwriting seemed sharper, more hurried, like she was writing in a hurry. There was indeed a mold of lasagna, my favorite dish, in the fridge, but there was no appetite. I poured myself a whiskey and went up to the study. Among the books on medicine and Civil War history on the shelf was a mahogany box where I kept important documents. Pulling out my credit card statements for the past month, I began to scrutinize each line. The further I read, the colder I felt inside. In addition to paying for the cruise, there were other odd expenses there. An expensive women's clothing boutique, a jewelry store, restaurants we'd never been to. The sound of a car pulling up made me wince. The door slammed, and a moment later the key turned in the lock. I heard Vivian coming up the stairs, her heels tapping on the wooden steps a little slower than usual, like she was tired. "Terrence?" She peered into the study. "Are you still awake?" Her face seemed especially beautiful in the light of the desk lamp. The new hairdo. When had she had time to cut her hair? And that dress. She hadn't worn such revealing outfits to work before. "I got a notice from the bank," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, "about the charge for the cruise." She froze on the threshold. Something resembling panic flashed in her eyes for a split second, but it disappeared immediately. "Ah, that—" She waved her hand carelessly. "The company will reimburse you at the end of the month. It's just easier with the accounting. I wanted to tell you, but I kept getting distracted by something." A plausible explanation. Too plausible. "Of course," I smiled. Just was surprised by the amount. "You know how prices are these days." She reached over and kissed me lightly on the cheek. "I'm awfully tired. Shall we go to bed?" I lay awake for a long time that night, listening to my wife's steady breathing. 15 years, 15 years we had fallen asleep and woken up together, shared joys and sorrows, made plans for the future. I knew every feature of her face, every intonation of her voice. I woke up in the morning with the clear intention of figuring it all out. After all, I was a surgeon, a man accustomed to acting methodically and rationally. If there is a problem, there must be a solution. You just have to find the right approach, like a complex operation. They say the truth is like a spider's web. Start pulling on one thread, and the whole structure will go into motion. I didn't want to be paranoid. I didn't want to doubt the woman I'd lived with for 15 years. But every morning now began with a study of bank statements and a strange feeling like I was living in someone else's house. That morning, a week before Vivian was supposed to leave, I overslept for the first time in years. The alarm bell rang through the heavy sleep, the consequence of a sleepless night and 2 glasses of whiskey. Vivian had already left, leaving the usual note on the kitchen table. "Important presentation today. I'll be back late. Kisses." I mechanically made myself a cup of coffee, took some toast out of the bread box. Everything was as usual, but every movement felt alien, unnatural. My phone vibrated, a message from Marcus. "Remember that coin I told you about? Found some more information. Meet me at the Old Colonial for lunch?" The Old Colonial was our favorite bar near the hospital. I agreed, even though Civil War coins were the least of my interests right now. At the hospital, I had a complicated surgery waiting for me, a prosthetic mitral valve replacement on a young patient. Usually, such interventions required full concentration, but today, the work was a salvation. In the operating room, there was no room for doubts and suspicions, only clear movements honed by years of practice. "Great job, Dr. Holbrook," Ruth said after the surgery, "although you seem a little different." Different? I looked at my reflection in the chrome surface of the instrument table. Same person, same facial features. So why does it feel like someone else is looking at me? The Old Colonial smelled of wood and ale. Marcus was already waiting at our usual table by the window, an untouched cup of coffee in front of him. "How's an old friend doing?" he said instead of greeting. I'd known Marcus for 20 years. We'd done residency together, experienced our first patient losses together, celebrated successful surgeries together. He'd been best man at my wedding. Not sleeping lately, I sank into a chair. Because of the conference? If only, I mused, looking at the old photographs on the walls of the bar. Chicago in the early 20th century, the first automobiles, people in bowler hats and long dresses, a whole era frozen in time. Vivian's going on a cruise, a corporate gift from the company. What's the big deal? Marcus finally sipped his coffee. $15,000 charged to my card for this gift. Marcus slowly set his cup down. Maybe some kind of mistake? I thought so too, but then I started noticing details. I told him everything. The strange expenses, the new perfume, the late returns from work. With each word, the picture became clearer and clearer, like someone wiping fogged glass. "Listen," Marcus stepped forward. "You're a surgeon. You're used to working with facts, not conjecture. Check things out properly before you jump to conclusions. He was right. I needed proof, not vague suspicions. Back at the hospital, I canceled the day's consultations and locked myself in my office. I opened my laptop, logged into a shared email account Vivian, and I used it to store important documents. The travels folder appeared empty. The next step was to call the cruise company. Royal Caribbean, how may I help you? The operator's voice sounded friendly and impersonal. Good afternoon. I wanted to clarify my reservation information. The payment went through from my card a week ago. Certainly, please state the reservation number or the passenger's name. Vivian Holbrook. A pause. A clatter of keys. Yes, I see a reservation for a Caribbean cruise, departing January 23rd from Miami. Deluxe double cabin with balcony. Double. There was a buzz in my ears. I'm sorry, did you say double? Yes, sir. A reservation for two, Vivian Holbrook and... The operator fell silent. I'm sorry, I can't release information about the second passenger without their consent. I thanked and hung up. My hands shook as I poured myself water from the carafe. A few drops spilled onto the table, leaving dark stains on the papers. A double cabin. Not a group trip with coworkers, not a corporate gift. A personal trip for two, paid for with my money. The rest of the day passed like a blur. I mechanically made rounds, signed papers, answered interns' questions, and my mind kept going back and forth. Who is he? How long ago? Why hadn't I noticed before? That evening, instead of driving home, I parked outside Vivian's office. Her silver Lexus was parked in its usual spot. I waited, looking out the lighted windows of the building until, one by one, almost all the lights went out. It was almost 10 when she got out. But not alone. A tall man in a dark coat held the door for her. They walked together to the parking lot, talking softly. At Vivian's car, he leaned toward her to see if anyone was around, and gave her a quick kiss on the cheek. I sat with my hands on the steering wheel until both cars were out of sight. Then I started the engine and drove home, keeping just the right distance from the silver Lexus. Every stoplight, every turn, sent a throbbing in his temples. At home, Vivian was her usual self. She talked about the previous day, asked about her surgeries. Then she took a long shower. I could hear the water running behind the bedroom wall. When she finally got into bed, she smelled like that new perfume again. She used to always wash off her makeup before bed, but tonight there was a faint trace of mascara on her pillow. Good night, darling. The familiar words, the familiar kiss on the cheek. Good night, I replied, looking up at the ceiling. That night I didn't sleep again. Lying there, listening to the breathing of the woman I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world. The next days became an endless series of agonizing hours. Every morning I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that didn't let go until nightfall. In the operating room, my hands remained as steady as ever, but inside everything was shaking with tension. Vivian started packing 3 days before we left. I watched as she piled new dresses into her suitcase, bright, open, not at all like her usual closet. Some still had tags from the very expensive boutique I'd found bills from in the statements. Are you sure you need this many outfits for a corporate trip? I asked, trying to keep my voice sound casual. She fidgeted over her suitcase for a second. There will be formal dinners. We need to match. I stared at her hands, carefully smoothing the folds on the navy-colored silk dress. Those hands had once held me in the morning, made my favorite coffee, held my palms at important moments in my life. Now they seemed alien. At the hospital, I barely left my office, immersed in studying the cruise ship itinerary. The Royal Princess was scheduled to depart from Miami, stop in the Bahamas, then the Caribbean. I wrote down dates and ports, as if I were preparing for the most important surgery of my life. Dr. Holbrook, Ruth peeked into the office. You have a patient in room 412, complaining of chest pains. I'll be right there. I slammed my laptop shut, but she didn't leave. Are you all right? You haven't been yourself the last few days. I tried to smile. Just a lot of work. And Vivian's leaving soon. Oh, yes, the cruise. Ruth nodded. My sister just got back from one recently. She says they even make a chapel for wedding ceremonies on these liners now. Can you imagine? A chapel? Weddings? Vivian and I once dreamed of renewing our vows on our 20th anniversary. That was still 5 years away. Now that dream seemed as far away as the islands where the cruise ship was headed. That evening, I sat in my study at home, going through old photographs. Here is our first meeting in the university library. She was looking for a book on economics. I was preparing for anatomy exams. Here's the wedding. Vivian in a white dress, a happy smile on her face. Honeymoon in Italy, the first house, traveling, holidays. 15 years fit into one box of photos. 15 years of breakfast together, candlelight dinners, Sunday strolls along the seafront. All that time I thought I was building a fortress, but in reality I was living in a house of cards. The ringing of the phone made me flinch. "Marcus, are you sure you want to do this?" he asked without preamble. I'd already told him my plan. Buy a ticket on the same liner, board at one of the intermediate ports. Do I have a choice? There's always a choice, Terrence. You could just ask her straight out. And what am I going to hear? Another lie about a corporate gift? There was silence on the phone. Then Marcus sighed heavily. "I booked you a room in Miami. For January 25th. The liner arrives in the Bahamas on the 26th in the morning." "Thank you." I squeezed the phone. "I need to know the truth." "Be careful and keep me posted." After the conversation, I went down to the kitchen. Vivian was cooking dinner. The smell of roasted garlic and basil filled the house. Just an ordinary evening, ordinary home smells. So why did everything seem so fake? "I made pasta," she smiled, stirring the sauce. "Your favorite recipe." "Looks delicious." I sat down at the table, watching her movements. Every gesture, every turn of her head, it was all so familiar and yet so foreign at the same time. "Excited for the trip?" I asked, as she placed a plate in front of me. "A little." She took a seat across from me. First cruise, after all. My mouth was dry, the pasta seemed tasteless. "I hope the weather's nice." I tried to sound casual. "There are storms in the Caribbean this time of year." "It'll be fine." She reached for the salt, and I noticed the new bracelet on her wrist. A thin gold chain with a small heart on it. She hadn't worn jewelry like that before. At night, I couldn't sleep again. I lay staring at the ceiling and counted the days until I left. 3. Only 3 days until she'd be gone. And in 3 more days, I'd board the same liner. First thing in the morning, I checked my ticket reservations. Everything was set. Flight to Miami, hotel room, cruise ticket. All that was left was to wait and pretend nothing was happening. At work, I tried to focus on the patients, but my thoughts kept coming back to the upcoming trip. What will I say when I see them? What would I do? In 15 years of practice, I'd learned to keep my cool in the most difficult situations, but this was different. "Dr. Holbrook," the intern's voice brought me back to reality. "Patient in ICU?" "Coming." I rose from my desk. Work. Only work could save me from going crazy these days. In the evening, when I got home, I found Vivian doing her final packing. She was putting her makeup into her travel purse, humming something under her breath. I stood in the bedroom doorway, staring at her reflection in the mirror. When had she managed to become such a stranger? "You're early today." She smiled at me through the mirror. "Yeah, last surgery got canceled." I made my way into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. "Do you want me to drive you to the airport the day after tomorrow?" "No need, honey. The company has booked a shuttle for everyone involved." Another lie. I could almost physically feel them piling up between us, all the little and big deceptions becoming an insurmountable wall. "Suit yourself." I stood up and walked over to the window. It was starting to snow outside, large flakes falling slowly in the light of the street lamps. "I hope it's warmer in Miami." "They promised plus 25. She closed her makeup bag. "I bought new sunscreen like you recommended." I stared at the falling snow and thought about how in a few days I'd see a very different picture: the turquoise waters of the Caribbean, the white beaches, the blazing sun. And somewhere out there, on a huge cruise ship, I would finally learn the whole truth. Miami greeted me with a stifling heat wave. After the January cold of Chicago, it seemed almost mocking, as if the climate itself was mocking my condition. At the airport, I took a cab to the harbor, staring at the palm trees and the bright blue sky, so inappropriately festive. The Royal Princess towered over the pier like a small city. 18 decks, thousands of portholes, its white hull gleaming in the midday sun. I stood in line to board, clutching the handle of a small suitcase. Somewhere out there, on one of those decks, was my wife, with another man. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Holbrook." The girl at check-in smiled, handing me a key card. "Your cabin is on deck 12, number 1234. I nodded mechanically, taking the paperwork. It was cool inside the ship. The air conditioning systems worked perfectly. The central lobby was impressive, a multi-level structure with marble staircases, crystal chandeliers, and gilded railings. Everything around breathed luxury and festivity. My cabin was compact but comfortable. A single bed, a small balcony overlooking the ocean, and a light stone bathroom. There was a vase of fruit and a bottle of champagne on the table, a welcome gift from the cruise company. I grinned bitterly. "Welcome to your nightmare, Dr. Holbrook." Unpacking, I pulled out the schematic of the ship I'd studied back home. 12 restaurants, 5 pools, a spa, a theater, a casino. Where to find them amidst this maze of entertainment? I had the advantage that they were unaware of my presence on board. I could observe while remaining undetected. The corridor was lively. Other passengers were hurrying to explore the ship. Families with children, elderly couples, newlyweds. Ordinary, happy people who had come for a vacation. I felt like a ghost among them, a man with a completely different mission. "Excuse me," a woman's voice made me turn around. A young girl in a staff uniform was smiling at me. The name tag said Celeste on it. "You look a little lost. Can I help you?" "Yes, thank you." I pulled out a schematic of the ship. "Just trying to get my bearings." "Where's the main restaurant around here?" "Oh, that's just where I'm headed. Let me walk you out." We walked down the corridors, and Celeste talked about the ship. Her voice sounded soothing, almost hypnotic. "Are you traveling alone?" she asked as we approached the restaurant. "Yes." I tried to smile. "Needed a take my mind off work." "I understand. A lot of people come here for just that." She was quiet. "If you want company at dinner, I usually eat dinner at 7 at this restaurant. I don't like to eat alone." I thanked her and walked into the restaurant. The huge room with panoramic windows was half full. I chose a table in the corner, where I had a good view of the whole room. The waiter brought a menu, but I barely glanced at it. "Whiskey, double," was all I said. For the next 2 hours, I watched the people coming in. Every time the door opened, my heart started beating faster. But Vivian didn't show up. Perhaps they had chosen another restaurant. There were enough of them on the ship. In the evening, I went up to the top deck. The sun was setting into the ocean, coloring the sky and water in shades of gold and purple. Passengers gathered at the sides, taking pictures of the sunset, laughing. I stood off to the side, breathing in the salty sea air. "Beautiful, isn't it?" An elderly man stopped next to me. "This is the 100th time I've seen it, and it still takes my breath away." "Do you travel often?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the horizon. "Every year, ever since I was widowed." He pulled out a worn cigarette case. "You know what's the most interesting thing about these ships? Everyone here pretends to be happy, even those who've come to forget their grief." I looked at him more closely. His eyes were tired but wise. "I'm Marcus," I introduced myself, extending my hand. "Pleased to meet you, Marcus. I'm Gerald." He shook my hand. "Would you like to grab a drink at the bar? They say there's live music there tonight." I agreed, realizing I couldn't spend the whole evening wandering aimlessly around the decks. There was indeed a jazz band playing at the bar, the soft music creating a cozy atmosphere. "Here's to new acquaintances." Gerald raised his glass. "To the truth," I replied, taking a sip. We got to talking. Gerald turned out to be a former literature professor, traveled extensively, loved jazz and French wines. His company was strangely soothing, maybe because he didn't demand explanations for my mood. About 11 o'clock, I returned to the cabin. The ocean outside the window was a black abyss, with only the stars reflected in the water. I stepped out onto the balcony, breathing in the night air. Somewhere on this huge ship was the deluxe cabin where Vivian was now. With him. Sleep wasn't coming. I turned on the television. There was a broadcast from the cameras on the bow of the ship. The endless dark water cut by the bow. Hypnotic. The morning began with a speakerphone announcement, the captain greeting the passengers and reporting the weather. I showered, put on light-colored pants and shirt, typical vacationer attire. I needed to blend in to become invisible. At breakfast, I studied the schedule of events. In the evening, there was going to be a big show in the main theater. Night in Vegas. A lot of passengers would probably go there. It was a chance. The day stretched agonizingly slow. I walked around every public area of the ship, memorizing the location of exits, hiding places, and travel routes. As a surgeon, I was used to being methodical. It helped keep me sane. In the spa, I heard a familiar laugh. My heart stopped for a moment, but it wasn't Vivian. Just a similar voice. How many more false alarms like that did I have to endure? At lunch, Celeste joined me. She talked about her work on the ship, about the strange passengers, about the routes and the weather. I listened, half-listened, continuing to watch the entrance. "Are you looking for someone?" she suddenly asked. "What makes you think so?" "It's part of my job to notice details," she smiled. "You keep looking at doors and studying faces, like you're waiting for someone, or afraid to meet someone." I remained silent, taking a sip of water. Celeste nodded understandingly and changed the subject. The evening before the show, I took a seat at the bar overlooking the theater entrance. Sipping a non-alcoholic cocktail, I needed a clear head. I watched the audience arrive, and then I saw her. Vivian was wearing the very same navy-colored dress. Her hair was styled differently than usual. Next to her walked a tall man in a light-colored suit, the same one I'd seen outside the office. They were holding hands. My hand clutched the glass. Everything inside me shattered. It was one thing to suspect, and quite another to see it with my own eyes. They walked past me, not noticing me in the semi-darkness of the bar. I saw him lean toward her, whispering something in her ear. I saw her smile, so familiar and so foreign now. When they disappeared through the doors of the theater, I remained seated, unable to move. Everything was blurring before my eyes. 15 years of marriage turned to splinters in an instant. "Are you okay?" The bartender's voice came as if from far away. "Yeah," I placed the bill on the bar. "I'm perfectly fine." I stepped out onto the deck. The night air hit my face but brought no relief. Somewhere in the darkness, the ocean rumbled, but its noise couldn't drown out the rumbling in my head. I knew for sure now. I'd seen it with my own eyes. All that remained was to decide what to do next. After a sleepless night, I greeted the dawn on the upper deck. The first rays of sunlight painted the ocean pink, reminding me of another dawn 15 years ago, on our wedding trip. Vivian and I had greeted the morning by the sea then, too, in a small hotel on the coast of Italy. She laid her head on my shoulder and said, "Let's promise each other to meet every dawn together." Now she was meeting the dawns with another. The first passengers appeared on deck, people in gym clothes, ready for their morning jog. I watched them, feeling like a ghost in this world of the living. The ship was slowly approaching the Bahamas. A strip of land was already visible in the distance. "Good morning," Celeste appeared as if out of nowhere. She wore an impeccably pressed uniform, but shadows of fatigue lingered under her eyes. "You're early today." "Didn't sleep," I tried to smile. "How was the night shift?" "The usual. You know what the best part about working nights on a cruise ship? Seeing people for who they really are, no masks." I looked at her more closely. "What do you mean?" "At night, all pretense falls away. Happy couples bicker in the hallways, lonely people cry on balconies, and those who pose as model spouses during the day." She faltered. "I'm sorry. None of my business." "No, go on." My voice sounded hoarse. "What is it about model spouses?" Celeste shook her head. "It's just, sometimes people aren't what they seem, especially out here at sea where no one knows them." I thought about those words as I went down to my quarters. The ship was already awake. There were voices, laughter, and the sound of music coming from the cabins. Just an ordinary morning in a floating city of pleasure. After breakfast, I decided to visit the spa. Not because I wanted to relax. What relaxation is there? but because it was a logical place to observe. Many passengers spent time here between excursions. The huge room with panoramic windows was filled with lounge chairs. In the center was a heated seawater pool, with several jacuzzis surrounding it. I chose a lounger in the corner, where I had a good view of the whole room. "Would you like something to drink?" A waiter approached. "Water, please. No gas." An elderly couple sat down next to me. They were talking quietly, holding hands. How old are they? 70 years old? And still together, still looking at each other lovingly. 52 years, the woman said, as if reading my mind. "We're celebrating our wedding anniversary. Congratulations." I tried to make my voice sound sincere. I watched them walk away, leaning on each other. 52 years, and we hadn't lasted 15. Around noon, I saw them, Vivian and her companion, walking toward the pool. She was wearing a new swimsuit I hadn't seen before, white, with gold buckles. He put his hand on her waist in a possessive gesture. They settled into the hot tub, laughing and whispering. I watched her throw her head back, exposing her face to the spray. As he leaned toward her, whispering something in her ear. The way she smiled, the same smile that used to be reserved for me. My mouth was dry. I gulped down the water, but it didn't help. My insides burned like I'd swallowed hot coals. "Are you not feeling well?" Celeste asked quietly as she walked by. "You look very pale." "I'm fine." I stood up, trying not to look in the direction of the hot tub. "It's just stuffy in here." I literally flew out of the spa, unable to see the road. My feet brought me to the bar on their own. It was nearly empty at this time of day. "Whiskey," I tossed to the bartender. "Double." Gerald, the same professor we'd met yesterday, sat behind the bar. "Rough day?" he asked, watching me drain my glass. "Tough life," I waved at the bartender, asking for a repeat. "All great tragedies are built on the fact that people can't forgive betrayal, not even cheating. That's just a consequence. But the betrayal of trust." I looked at him. "And what do you think we should do about that?" "What would you do?" He was silent for a long time, looking into his glass. "I would want to know the truth. The whole truth, no matter how bitter it is. Because living with innuendo is worse than living with pain." After lunch, I went up to the promenade deck. The ship had already docked in the port of Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas. Passengers were leaving in groups for excursions. I saw Vivian and her companion get into a cab. They must have decided to explore the city on their own. I stayed on the ship. I wandered the empty corridors, peered into the closed bars and restaurants. Without the crowds, the cruise ship seemed ghostly, unreal. In my cabin, I pulled out my cell phone. 3 missed calls from Marcus. I should call him back, but what would I say? That I saw my wife kissing another man in the hot tub? That 15 years of my life turned out to be a lie? Instead, I opened the photo album again. Here we are celebrating a housewarming party in our first home, a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago. Vivian is standing on a stepladder, painting the walls yellow. She has a streak of paint on her nose, and I'm laughing and taking pictures instead of helping. Here's our first vacation together after the wedding, a trip to the Grand Canyon. We got up at 4 in the morning to greet the sunrise at the lookout. Vivian was shivering from the cold, so I wrapped her in my jacket. All those moments, were they real or were they also lies? When did everything start to fall apart? What had I missed? What had I not noticed? In the evening, I sat at the bar again, watching the passengers returning from their excursions. Vivian and her companion passed by around 9, tanned, happy, carrying bags from the gift stores. "More whiskey?" the bartender asked. "No," I shook my head. "That's enough for tonight." A man's voice snapped me out of a heavy sleep. "Good morning, dear passengers," the captain's announcement came over the speakers. "Today we are expected to cross to the island of St. Thomas. Sunny weather is expected and the temperature is 28 degrees. I lay listening to that cheerful voice and thought about the fact that somewhere on this ship, probably just a few cabins away, the woman I had loved for 15 years was waking up in the arms of another man. On my 3rd day on the ship, I already knew their routine. They had a late breakfast around 10 at the Ocean View restaurant on the top deck. He always ordered a salmon omelet, she a fruit salad and green tea. After breakfast, they usually spent time by the pool or at the spa. For lunch, they preferred the Italian restaurant on Deck 7 and spent their evenings at the ship's various entertainment venues. I watched them from afar, hiding behind a newspaper, book, or menu, feeling like a pathetic stalker. But I couldn't stop. Every touch they made, every look, every smile, it was like a knife to the heart, and yet I kept watching. "You're only making it worse for yourself," Celeste said, catching me doing another watching at the bar. She had obviously already guessed the situation, even though I hadn't said anything. "I need to know." My voice sounded hoarse. The whiskey in my glass had long since warmed, but I continued to twist it around in my hands. "What is it exactly? That your wife is happy with another man? I think that's obvious enough." Her words hit harder than a slap. I stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over my chair. "I'm sorry." Celeste caught my sleeve. "I didn't mean to. It just hurts to see you torturing yourself." At that moment, Vivian and her companion came out of the restaurant across the street. She was talking animatedly about something, waving her arms. Such a familiar gesture. She used to talk to me like that about her work projects, new ideas for the house, plans for the future. "His name is Lawrence." I didn't immediately realize I was speaking out loud. "He works with her at the same company. I've seen him a couple times at company parties, but I've never thought." Celeste listened silently. There was soft music playing at the bar, some old jazz standard. Couples danced, waiters handed out cocktails. A typical evening on a cruise ship. "I can see how happy she is. Really happy. I can't remember the last time I saw her so alive." "Maybe that's why you're not leaving. Because you want to understand. What does he give her that you couldn't?" I looked at Celeste. So young and already so wise. "When you work on a cruise ship, you see all sorts of things," she said, as if answering my unspoken question. "People's stories are like the palm of your hand, especially stories of lost love." I woke up the next morning with my head in a jumble. Outside the window, the ocean was rumbling, seagulls screeching somewhere in the distance. We were approaching yet another island. In the shower, I stood under the hot jets for a long time, trying to wash the weight off my shoulders. On the fogged mirror, I wrote with my finger, "Why?" and immediately erased it. The question that had plagued me all these days had no answer. I went down to breakfast earlier than usual, hoping to avoid meeting them. But fate had it differently. They were sitting at a table by the window, the sun illuminating her hair, creating a golden halo. He fed her strawberries from his plate. Such an intimate, such an everyday scene. I turned and walked out of the restaurant, almost knocking down the waiter with the tray. I leaned against the wall in the hallway, trying to regain my breath. My heart was pounding like crazy. "Dr. Holbrook?" Gerald's voice brought me back to reality. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, just stuffy," I tried to smile. "Let's go get some coffee on the deck. It's fresh air out there." We made ourselves comfortable in the deck chairs. The sea was calm, only light ripples covering the surface. "I saw them last night," Gerald said, stirring his coffee. "Your wife and her companion. They were at the theater for the evening show." "And what did they look like?" The question burst out on its own, like people who have forgotten about the rest of the world. You know, there's that special look lovers have, when only the two of them exist and everything else is blurred, like a bad photograph. I remembered that look. Vivian had once looked at me that way. "What are you going to do?" Gerald asked. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "Sometimes I want to go over and hit him. Sometimes you just want to ask, why? And most of the time I want to wake up and realize it's all a bad dream." The day dragged on endlessly. I wandered around the ship like a ghost, avoiding places where I could meet them. I went into the ship's library, a quiet place to hide from reality. On the shelf was Anna Karenina. I grinned bitterly. What a truly appropriate read for my situation. Only in my case, there was no dramatic finale on the railroad tracks. Just the quiet dying of a 15-year marriage in the setting of a luxury cruise. In the evening, I saw them again, this time at the casino. Vivian had never liked gambling, but now she was enthusiastically rolling the dice on the craps table. He stood beside her, putting his arm around her waist. They celebrated each win with a kiss. I sat at the bar across the hall, methodically getting drunk. The bartender already knew my order, a double whiskey. No ice. Will you stop? Celeste appeared as if out of nowhere. You're only making it worse. How could it get any worse? I grinned bitterly. It can. Trust my experience. She sat down next to me, ordering herself a mineral water. I watched Vivian hug Lawrence after another win. I really believed we'd be together until the end, didn't I? Made plans for the future. Wanted to buy a lake house for our old age. And now, I don't know if anything was ever real. Maybe she never really loved me. Maybe I was just a convenient option? Celeste shook her head. People rarely stay together for 15 years just out of convenience. Perhaps she did love you. It's just, love dies sometimes, even if we don't want it to. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the casino emptied. I watched them leave. Vivian staggered slightly from the champagne. He supported her by the waist. They didn't go to the elevators, but to the stairs, which meant their stateroom was somewhere on the upper decks. I followed them to the 12th floor. They stopped at cabin 1256, a suite with a balcony. I remembered the layout of the ship by heart. Before they opened the door, they kissed for a long time in the hallway. I stood around the corner, my nails digging into my palms. Inside, I was burning with pain and rage. I wanted to get out, to scream, to smash something. But I just stood there and watched the door close behind them. On the way back, I met Gerald. He was coming back from the bar. Now you know where their quarters are. It wasn't a question. Yes, I nodded. It remains to be decided what to do with that knowledge. Maybe it's time to stop hiding and face the truth? I remained silent. Quiet music played in the hallway. A cruise ship never sleeps completely. Somewhere in the distance, a couple laughed. The air conditioner hummed. The floorboards creaked under the carpet. Tomorrow, I finally said. I'll talk to them tomorrow. Gerald put a hand on my shoulder. I hope you find what you're looking for, even if it's not what you want to hear. I met the morning of the last day without sleep. I sat in my chair all night, looking at the ocean outside the window and going over the 15 years of our life together in my mind. Every moment, every word, every look, everything took on new meaning now that I knew the truth. Dawn colored the sky a soft pink. Somewhere in the distance, I could see the last island of our itinerary, St. Thomas. The ship was due to dock there in a few hours. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I went down to the ship's gym, needing something to keep me busy until breakfast. There were only a few people there at this early hour. I mechanically performed my exercises, looking out the panoramic windows at the approaching island. Good morning. Celeste appeared beside me. She was out of uniform. Apparently, she'd finished her shift. Today? Yes, I nodded, continuing to pedal the exercise bike. It ends today. Are you ready? It's impossible to be ready for something like this. She took a seat on a nearby exercise machine. You know, in my 3 years of working on cruise ships, I've seen all sorts of things. But for some reason, your story, it's special. How so? Most people, when they find out they've cheated, they make a scene, or they walk away quietly. But you, it's like you want to understand more than just the betrayal. I stopped the simulator. What is there to understand? My wife fell in love with someone else, used my money to take a romantic cruise with him. It's simple. If it were simple, you wouldn't have followed them for 4 days. You wouldn't have tortured yourself watching their happiness. There was a truth in her words that I didn't want to admit even to myself. After the gym, I went back to the cabin to take a shower. I pulled a fresh shirt out of my suitcase, a white cotton shirt Vivian had given me last Christmas. I put on light-colored pants, summer shoes. Looked at myself in the mirror. The man who looked back seemed like a stranger. At 9 o'clock, I took my usual table at the Ocean View restaurant. Ordered coffee and toast, but didn't touch it. Waited. They showed up at the beginning of 11. Vivian was wearing a light lavender-colored dress. A new one I'd never seen before. Her hair was gathered, and around her neck was a thin gold chain with a heart pendant. Lawrence, impeccably dressed as always, held her hand. They sat down at their usual table by the window. The waiter brought the menu, but they didn't even glance at it. Apparently, they already knew what they were going to order. I watched them talking, laughing, him brushing a strand of hair out of her face. It was time. I got up from the table. My legs felt like cotton. My mouth was dry. Each step was difficult, as if I were walking against a strong wind. Vivian saw me first. Her face froze, her eyes widened in horror. She grabbed Lawrence's arm, who still didn't understand. "Good morning." My voice sounded surprisingly calm. Lawrence turned around. His face reflected recognition. We had met at company parties, after all. "Terrence." Vivian could barely speak. "What are you... How did I get here?" I took a seat at their table as if I'd been invited. "Very simple. Saw the credit card charges. You didn't think I wouldn't notice $15,000, did you?" Lawrence straightened up. "Listen." "No, you listen." I looked him in the eye. "I'm not here to make a scene. I just want to understand." The restaurant grew quiet. Or was it just me? Maybe the people at the neighboring tables were still eating breakfast and talking, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. "Terrence." Vivian put her hand on the table but didn't touch me. "I was going to tell you." "When? After you got back? Or when my credit card would have run out?" She lowered her eyes. "I didn't know how to tell you. 15 years, Vivian. 15 years of marriage. Didn't I deserve at least an honest conversation? I didn't mean to hurt you." Her voice shook. "Is that better?" I grinned bitterly. "Finding out about the affair from a bank statement? Following you around the ship? Seeing you happy with someone else?" Lawrence put a hand on her shoulder, a protective gesture, as if I could hurt her. "How long has it been?" That question had plagued me all these days. 8 months, she answered quietly. 8 months. I mentally went back. What was going on in that time? Ordinary life. Work, dinners, weekends. Nothing loomed. Why? The big question. The one that kept me up at night. Vivian finally looked up. "Do you really want to know?" "Yes." "Because he makes me feel alive. Not just the wife of a successful surgeon, not part of an established household, but a living person with her own desires and dreams." Each word was like a stabbing blow. "Did you feel dead with me?" "No, Terrence. With you, I felt comfortable, calm, like in a museum where everything is beautiful, but you can't touch anything with your hands." I looked at the woman I thought I knew best in the world, and I didn't recognize her. "I loved you," I said simply. "I know." She lowered her head. "And I loved you. I really did. It's just gone." "Yeah." We sat in silence. Outside the window, the island of St. Thomas floated by. Green hills, white beaches, red-roofed houses, the usual tropical paradise. "What now?" Lawrence asked. He had been silent all this time, but now his voice sounded firm. "Now?" I stood up from the table. "Now you get off the ship and get on with your life. And I'll start mine all over again." "Terrence." Vivian held out her hand, but I stepped back. "Don't. Just be happy. If you can." I turned and walked toward the exit. I ran into Celeste at the door. She was carrying a tray of drinks. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "No," I answered honestly. "But maybe someday I will be." In my quarters, I sat on my bed and let myself cry for the first time in days. Tears streamed down my face, dripping onto my white shirt. Her last gift to me. Outside the window, the ocean rumbled. The ship was slowly docking at the island. A few more hours and it would truly be over. The last hours on the ship stretched agonizingly long. I packed my things, as if I hadn't even lived here these endless days, and sat in a chair by the window. I watched the ship mooring, the harbor workers bustling below, the first passengers coming down the gangway. There was a knock at the door. I knew it wasn't her. Vivian never came to say goodbye. "Come in," I said without turning around. Celeste brought coffee and croissants. "You didn't come down for breakfast." "Thanks, but I'm not hungry." "I know, but you need your strength." She sat down on the edge of the bed. The cabin was tidy. The maids had already cleaned up. Only the crumpled sheets gave away the sleepless night. "How are you?" she asked quietly. I grinned, like a man who's lost everything and gained freedom at the same time. It's a strange feeling. You haven't lost everything, only illusions. There was a wisdom in her words that her age didn't match. I took a cup of coffee, hot, strong, with a slight bitterness. The kind Vivian used to make in the mornings. "No, don't think about it." The loudspeaker announced the start of disembarkation. The captain's voice sounded cheerful and celebratory. For most people, it was just the end of a wonderful vacation. "Is there anyone to meet you at the port?" Celeste asked. "No, I took a ticket on the evening flight to Chicago. Then you have time to see the island." I shook my head. "I don't think I'm capable of appreciating the beauty of the Caribbean right now." There was a commotion in the hallway as passengers began to take their luggage out. Laughter, voices, the clatter of suitcases on the floor. The usual hustle and bustle of the last day of a cruise. I approached the balcony for the last time. The island of St. Thomas spread out before us in all its glory. Emerald hills sloping down to turquoise water, white beaches, yachts in the marina. Paradise on earth, which for me will forever be the place where my family life died. "You know what?" Celeste stood up. "I finish my shift in an hour. I can show you around the city. Not the tourist spots, but the actual island." "Why are you doing this?" I turned to her. "Taking care of an unfamiliar passenger?" "Because no one should be alone at a time like this, even if he thinks being alone is exactly what he needs." There was genuine concern in her eyes. Not pity. I couldn't stand pity, but just human concern. "All right," I said. "Show me your island." I spent the next hour in the ship's library, waiting for her shift to end, watching the last passengers leave the ship. They were among them Vivian in her lavender dress, Lawrence with their luggage. They didn't look back. Gerald found me there. "Heard the news already? How are you?" "Alive," I shrugged, although sometimes I wish I could just erase the last 15 years from my memory. We exchanged contacts. He promised to write the next time he was in Chicago. Celeste showed up exactly an hour later, no longer in uniform, in a simple summer dress and straw hat. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, picking up my suitcase. We walked down the gangway, the last passengers on this cruise. The humid tropical air fell over us like a warm blanket. "Coffee first," Celeste said. "I know a great place in the old town." We walked down narrow streets paved with ancient cobblestones. The houses here were old, colonial, with iron balconies and brightly colored walls. Not at all like the tourist postcards. The cafe was tiny, with only 3 tables. The elderly woman behind the counter greeted Celeste like an old acquaintance. "They make the best coffee on the island here," Celeste said, "and they don't keep sugar. They think it kills the flavor." The coffee was indeed delicious, tart with light citrus notes. "Tell me about the island," I asked. Anything to keep my mind off what had happened this morning. And she did. About the pirates who had once taken refuge in the coves here. About the old forts, about the local legends. Her voice had a calming effect. We climbed the hill that overlooked the entire harbor. The Royal Princess was still at the dock, a snow-white giant against the blue sea. The day was winding down as we made our way back to the harbor. My flight was in 2 hours. "Thank you," I said. "For everything." "You're welcome," she smiled. "You know what I'll tell you? You're stronger than you think you are, and one day you'll be grateful for this experience." "Grateful for the betrayal?" "For the fact that it set you free. Sometimes you have to lose something precious to find yourself." I watched her walk away, a small figure in a summer dress. She didn't look back. At the airport, I bought a bottle of water and sat down in the lounge. Pulled out my phone. A few missed calls from Marcus, a text from Gerald, no calls from Vivian. The sun was setting behind the huge windows of the airport. The sky was colored the same shades of pink as it had been that morning when I'd first seen the Royal Princess. It seemed like a lifetime had passed since then.